Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last. I don't know if you guys can see that. I don't know why it doesn't focus on that. There we go. Leaders Eat Last. Anyways, it's a great book for leadership. I highly recommend it. But there was a story that I think really blew my mind or made me kind of wake up a bit. So, obviously World War II with the Holocaust and all the Jewish and, all the Jews getting what happened to them. I don't really want to talk too much about it. There's a story about one of the people who obviously was a Nazi. I can't really say his name properly, but there was a Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, played a significant role in the organization of the Holocaust. He was responsible for managing the logistics of rounding up and deporting mass numbers of Jews and other unwanted groups to the ghettos and concentration camps across Eastern Europe. He was the one who oversaw the process that sent innocent men, women, and children, young and old, to the death camps. But after the war, using falsified papers, he was able to escape Germany and make his way to Argentina. For 15 years, Eichmann lived in a relatively normal suburban life under the name Ricardo Klement until he was captured by Israeli agents in 1960 and brought back to face trial in Jerusalem. I'm just trying to figure out what part I'm going to actually say. The amount of planning, organization, and logistics required to help the help of thousands, if not millions of people. It required the involvement of all levels of soldiers perpetrating the actual crimes and millions of ordinary Germans willfully turning a blind eye. Blah, 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 blah. Some believe that there was a collective intent that an entire population had abandoned all humanity and morality. Others saw it differently. The common defense that many Nazis and Germans offered after the war was less dramatic. We had no choice, they said. We were just following orders. That was the mantra. So that was a lot of things that people used to say, is that they're just following orders, They were just following orders to, survive, to be, they're just following the person that they looked up to, which I thought was really interesting, right? And now, in all honesty, guys, do you reckon this guy should, be executed and sent to jail and all that kind of stuff for the crimes he committed on, like not actually doing anything about it and just letting these Jews die and all that kind of stuff? Because in my opinion, I believe if I was in his situation, I wouldn't be able to do it. I would just, fucking, I don't know. I don't even know what you would do in that situation. Like if you're a German and you're a soldier and you were told to follow these orders, and obviously you've been told to follow orders, would you do it? The question is, I thought I wouldn't, and a lot of people thought they wouldn't either, and that's why there was this big experiment of seeing if people were, pretty much told to do things that were against their morals and was immoral. Would they actually follow the orders? And this experiment will absolutely blow your mind. So here it is. So in 1961, just a few months after Adolf Eichmann's trial began in Israel, Milgram designed an experiment to understand our obedience to authority. The experiment was relatively simple. In each statement, there were two volunteers. One would play the role of the teacher, and the other would play the role of the student. The person who played the student was actually another scientist involved in the experiment. To sign the roles, the real volunteer was asked to pick a piece of paper out of a hat that indicated if they would be the teacher or the student. In fact, both folded pieces of paper said teacher on them, giving the illusion to the volunteer that their role was picked by chance. So they believed that they were actually, out of a 50-50, they actually got the teacher, not the student, even though both of them got student, right? So they felt a bit more superior. So the volunteers who played the role of the teachers recruited from a newspaper ad and told they were taking part in an investigation into memory and learning, sat at a console with a series of switches. Each one was told a series of questions would be asked of the student. If the student got the wrong answer or refused to answer the question, The teacher was to flip a switch on the console to administer an electric shock to the student. In fact, the only electric shocks administered during the entire experiment were mild 15-volt shocks given to the teacher just so they could have a sense of what it felt like. There were 30 switches on the console labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts, with each switch labeled in 15-volt increments. So obviously it wasn't 450 volts, it's just 15 volts, but they didn't know that, the teachers. Made very clear to the teacher that with each switch, the shocks would get increasingly more severe. To make sure that the teacher understood the implications of the increasing severity of the shocks, there was also labels placed above certain ranges. The voltages ranged from 15 to 75, for example, was labeled slight shock. Written above 75 to 120 volt range of switch was moderate shock. The 135 to 180 volt range was labeled strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock. Covered the next few ranges until the voltages reached danger severe shocks above the 375 to 420 volt switches. The final range, 435 to 450 volts, was painted red and marked simply XXX. There was no confusion as to what as to what that switch meant. The 160 volunteers were put through the experiment with 4 variants. 40 volunteers for each setup in one variation. The scientist playing the student sat right next to the teacher, and the teacher had to physically place the student's hand onto a shock plate. In another variation, the student was in the room with the teacher. The teacher could see and hear the student's reaction after each shock was administered. There was no uncertainty about the impact of each successive decision to flip a switch. In another variation, the student was kept in a separate room. Though the teacher was unable to see the effect of the shock, they could clearly hear the students protest and scream through the walls. In all of these variations, the teachers could hear the scientist playing the role of the student, pretending to express discomfort at first, and then shouting and pleading for the experiment to the end as it is progressed. Stop, they would scream. This hurts. In yet one more variation, however, the student was kept in another room. But for the thumping on the walls, the teacher could neither see nor hear the student's reaction to the shocks. As expected, all the volunteers expressed concerns as they realized or believed they were causing pain to the students. They look up at the scientist and standing next to them in a white lab coat with a clipboard in hand asked if they should continue. Because obviously they felt like this is against morals, like making someone go through pain. So they would ask the person in charge, like as if they would ask Hitler or, like the person in charge. So this one is obviously the scientist. Despite the pain they were knowingly inflicting, the first time the volunteer expressed a desire to stop the experiment or no longer to be a part of it, the scientist would say, please continue. If the volunteer expressed a desire to stop a second time, the scientist would say, the experiment requires that you continue. As they went further and further down the line of switches, some of the volunteers started to get nervous, very nervous. They started sweating and shaking. Although extremely uncomfortable, most went on with the experiment. Upon the third request to halt the experiment, the scientist replied coldly, it is absolutely essential that you continue. So imagine if you were like a Nazi soldier and you were obviously gassing all these Jews, but and you felt horrible about it. You didn't want to do this anymore, but the people in charge just kept pushing you to keep going and going and going and saying that it's your order, it's your what you're supposed to do, right? How far do you think these people would have gone? How much pain could you cause someone before you would stop? Most of us would say we would not go very far and that we would have quit long before we believe we had caused any serious harm to someone. And the scientists expected the same thing. Before the experiment, they predicted that 2 to 3% would go all the way, and those people would exhibit psychopathic tendencies. But the actual result were horrifying. When the volunteers had to physically place the student's hand on the shock plate, 70% quit the experiment without going very far. When the volunteers were in the same room but didn't have to physically touch the students, the number went down slightly, with 60% refusing to continue. So that means 40% continued to even though they could hear the people in pain, and they went through the whole thing. Okay? But when they could neither see the students in pain or hear the cries, only 35% refused to continue. This means 65% of the volunteers were able to go through the entire experiment, reach the final switch, and for all intents and purposes, kill someone. The experiment has been criticized for being unethical and for good reasons. Nearly 8 people who woke up in the morning with the belief they were good people went home the day with the knowledge that they could kill someone. Though they expressed a concern, know they were nervous, know they had sense that they were doing could have a negative impact, even a seriously negative impact, the majority still went all the way. Upon the conclusion of the experiment, despite believing that the student may be hurt or worse, the volunteers expressed concern for their own culpability, insisting that they should not be held responsible. Not a single volunteer showed any concern for the students' well-being. None asked to look in the other room. They were more concerned with their own skins. Eventually, volunteers were debriefed and shown that the student who was played by someone was fine and unhurt. They were assured that no shocks were given, that no pain was caused at any time. Some of those who obeyed, who went all the way, now felt remorse for what they had done. They had a sense of personal responsibility. Others who went all the way, in contrast, justified their actions by blaming these scientists. If there were any repercussions, they reasoned it would be the guys in charge, not them, who would be responsible. After all, they were just doing as they were told. So even went as far to transfer blame to students. He was so stupid and stubborn, said one volunteer, trying to come to terms with his action. He deserved to be shocked. Interestingly, nearly all those volunteers refused to continue to take part in the experiment once they realized they were causing pain to someone else, felt accountable to a greater moral imperative. Some were religious, but all of them felt they were accountable to a higher authority than the scientists in the room. The reality is, Milgram's experiment is being carried out every single day in offices across the country around the world. The cycle of abstraction endemic to our brand of capitalism is easy seen when we take a broader view of Milgram's conclusion. Abstraction is no longer restricted to physical space. It also includes the abstraction nature of numbers the bigger our company gets. The more physical distance is created between us, the people who work for us or buy our products at such scale, we can no longer just walk into aisles and count the cans of soup on the shelf either. Now we rely on documents that report numbers on what we've sold and how much we've made. When we divorce ourselves from humanity through numerical abstractions, we are like Milgram's volunteers, capable of inhuman behavior. Just like the conditions Milgram set in his experiment, this physical separation between us and those on the receiving end of our decisions can have a traumatic impact on lives. The lives of people who cannot be seen or heard. The more abstract people became, the more capable we are doing of harm. So that just really blew my mind in terms of, like, if we don't know what pain we're doing, or we don't know what we're causing to people because we're not right there next to them to see it or hear it, then we can do really inhumane things. That really just, I didn't expect that. I really did not expect that. I don't know if you guys would have expected people to do that, but when you don't know the pain that you're putting someone through because you can't physically see it, you're more likely to do things that you wouldn't morally do. And that's why you see a lot of companies, right? Because they're so high up, they don't need to go and visit the actual employees anymore or anything like that, that they do some really inhumane things, like, cut someone's pay in half, and they don't really care because they don't know how it's affecting other people. One of the big things was like Bank of America back in the days. They did a thing where they were only thinking about themselves. They didn't really care about the customer because obviously they weren't close with the customers. And what they did is they had, every time you were going to, I think it was a $5 monthly thing of holding your money in the bank. Every single time you held your money in the bank, you would get charged $5 a month for holding your money there. It was just ridiculous. And it was obviously for them to make more money. And it did not go well with everyone else. There was people who were really struggling, living paycheck to paycheck. And then obviously the extra $5 on top of that was a lot. $5 back then was a lot more than it is now. So I don't know, guys, but for me, that was just really awesome and interesting to find out that we really don't really know ourselves, because it was just like, I thought if I was in the same, position of these Nazi soldiers, that I would just be like, no, fuck this, I'm out. But the thing is, if you don't know the pain that you're causing to people, because obviously they were just in gas chambers and they couldn't hear them cry or anything like that. It was gas, like they would just die. That they didn't really, it didn't have as much impact as it would have if they were in that room watching them die and like suffocate, or I don't even know what actually happens, but I'm pretty sure they just breathe in and they just die. But that's why there was so many people in the Nazis, and that's why Adolf Hitler had so much control over everyone, because he could get them to follow orders, and they didn't have to actually deal with the actual pain. And they blamed it on Adolf. They blamed it on the actual Jews. Like they didn't take ownership because obviously they believed that they were just following orders. Like all of us in life, when we do some really unethical things, we just believe we're following orders, and that's what we should do. And that's just how it is. So I just found it was really interesting, and hope you guys enjoyed that. So if you guys want to know more about that kind of stuff, I'm happy to share more. But